Good day guys, I'm Mini War Painter. In this video I'm going to tell you all about contrasting in temperature and how it can change your way of thinking when you're deciding what colours to go with when painting your minis. I will explain all this whilst demonstrating on the loincloth on the Exalted Sorcerer I've been painting during this series. I'll catch you after the intro. Before we begin, let's talk contrast. What is it? It's the state of being strikingly different from something else. In miniature painting, there are numerous forms to contrast to which we speak of. Contrasting light compared to dark, contrasting texture from smooth silk to rough leather. There are contrasting colours, which reverts to the colour wheel. Here you can identify complementary colours such as blue and orange, red and green, purple and yellow. But this is another topic on its own, which I may discuss in a later video. The form of contrast that this video is all about is contrast in temperature, so warm colours to cool colours. Looking at the colour wheel, you can divide it in half to identify these colours and to what category they fit. Warm colours go from purpley red to yellowy green, whilst cool colours stretch from purple over to green. Whilst this is in mind, however, what about whites and blacks? Can these be presented as warm or cool? Of course they can. To warm up white, you can mix a little beige, such as Ushanti Bone or even Zandri Dust. To cool down white, you can mix a bluey grey, such as Ulthuan Grey or Celestial Grey. As for black, you can give this a cool vibe by mixing a little blue or turquoise into your black, such as Incubi Darkness or Thunderhawk Blue. But why would you consider doing this? Why not let black be black and white be white? The answer is that it will make your models far more interesting to look at. For example, if I've got a cold blue dominated model such as the Thousand Suns, it would benefit the interest of the viewer to see warm white used on the loincloth that covers the armour. If I've got a warm green Death Guard Noxious Blightbringer, then his apron at the front would serve well to be painted a cool white. If you're painting a model like Cypher, whose black power armour is shrouded by a warm coloured cloak, the black armour would look more interesting if highlighted using cool colours such as Incubi Darkness and Thunderhawk Blue. I hope you found this interesting. Now let's get on with some painting. Part 5. The loincloth. So I'm going to paint this loincloth a warm white. As discussed earlier, a warm white will contrast nicely against the cold blue armour of the Thousand Suns. I'll begin basing it Ushanti Bone, followed by establishing the darkest areas with Zandri Dust, and begin smoothing out the transitions. Then I'll look to brighten the higher portions of the folds with Pallid Rakarth Flesh to seal in the fact that it is a white loincloth and not a beige one. With the base coat established, it's time to apply a couple of streaks of Zandri Dust to the deeper creases and recesses of the loincloth. Be sure to add plenty of water for better control of the paint, and once completed, reapply some Ushanti Bone to the higher folds of the creases, where you may have gotten a little excited with the Zandri Dust, just to neaten them up. With the shaded areas complete, the next stage is to smoothing out the transition from Ushanti Bone to Zandri Dust, focusing more on the prominent shaded area under his gold chest plate. This will require a lot of patience from going backwards and forwards from one mix of Ushanti Bone and Zandri Dust to another, with plenty of water to help glaze, feather and wet blend those transitions. For those of you unfamiliar with those terms, allow me to explain. But to avoid confusion, I need to inform you that whilst I explain, I am not demonstrating these techniques. The footage you are watching is all three of these techniques mashed together in order to get the best outcome possible, situation dependent. Glazing is applying a watered down paint to a surface with the goal to tint the area to gain the blend. This requires a lot of time and patience to allow one layer to dry before applying the next. This technique will demand the most amount of layers to achieve the blend, but is known to be the most smoothest result should it be done correctly. Feathering is when you take a clean damp brush and gently pull away all the wet paint that you've just applied to the model, in the attempt to taper off the pigment towards the direction of the other colour you wish to blend up to. This technique is faster than glazing but can often look a little patchy due to the pulling apart of the pigment as you feather it out. Finally, wet blending, which is my personal favourite. Despite not using it that often during this series, this is achieved by slapping on one tone of colour to the model, possibly your highlight, and before it can dry, load your brush with the colour you wish to transition to, and apply it to the model in respect to where you want it to go. And as though using your model as a palette, work the paint into the first colour and begin mixing the colours together on your model. Once mastered, this technique can be very effective and quick to achieve, but can be frustrating at times as you fall into a never-ending chase of your own tail in the pursuit of perfection. Now that those darker transitions have been achieved, I have now added some Pallid Wych Flesh to my wet palette as I now begin blending up to that white finish. It was around this point that I was beginning to regret shading down to Zandri Dust in the shallow fold below the golden chestplate, as it appeared to look excessively dark in contrast to Pallid Wych Flesh. It should have dawned on me that with wanting the cloth to be predominantly Pallid Wych Flesh, I should have based it with Pallid Wych Flesh rather than Ushanti Bone, and blended down to Ushanti Bone instead of Zandri Dust. This wasn't a problem. All it meant I needed to do was go over the Zandri Dust with Ushanti Bone and blend up to Pallid Wych Flesh, but this sort of thing happens all the time. The important thing is that you identify what's bothering you and work out what it is you can do instead. Moving now on to the ribbons that hang either side of the loincloth. These are far more easy to paint. There's less blending required as there isn't any demanding folds other than the sharp creases at the top of his armour. These just needed highlighting up to Pallid Wych Flesh, along with the whole length of both ribbons, leaving a fine line of Zandri Dust in the recesses at the top. That's the warm white completed, and as you can see, they complement nicely to the contrasting cold armour. The next stage is to paint the embossed details to the trim on the loincloth, starting off with basing it with Screamer Pink. I've gone with Screamer Pink because it ties in well with the colour of the cape I painted in an earlier video. After basing, I move on to preparing a darker tone of my Screamer Pink by mixing in some Abaddon Black. I'll use this mix to shade the recess of the small scarabs embossed on the loincloth. Now, with some pink horror on my palette, I'll mix a small amount of it into Screamer Pink to start the highlights of the trim, aiming to brighten up on the lower side trims and where the trim rises in the wave of the loincloth on the bottom trim. After each pass of highlights, I'll keep adding a little more pink horror as I go along until I'm highlighting with pure pink horror, being sure to leave a small amount of the previous step showing on the trim in order to achieve that blended transition. To finish off the highlights on the trim, I mix a small amount of Rakarth Flesh into pink horror, just to give me that same final highlight I went up to when I highlighted his cape in one of the previous videos. Finally, to conclude my efforts on this trim, I went back to the darker recessed tone I used for the scarab details and applied this in the darker areas of the trim to help my highlights pop out that little bit more. And there's the loincloth complete. You may also notice the rear of the loincloth between his legs. Although this will be concealed by his cape when I assemble his backpack, I still painted this area with Ushanti Bone and Zandri Dust mixtures. Thanks for watching guys, I hope you enjoyed the video. Earlier on I talked briefly about glazing, feathering and wet blending. All three are great techniques for any intermediate painter. As I only explained them briefly, you can easily find more information about these techniques on YouTube. Just search for the name of the technique followed by miniature painting, and you shouldn't be far from some great advice on how to develop these techniques yourself. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up. If you're on Instagram, you can follow me at miniwar_painter. Here you can keep up to date on all my current progression, as I like to post regularly in my stories. If you haven't yet, don't forget to subscribe and don't be shy to mix those paints. Ta-ra!